When my wife walked through the door after her trip, the first thing I noticed wasn't her suitcase, or the way she avoided eye contact, or even the silence that followed her presence into the room. It was something far more subtle, something that didn't need words to exist. A shift in atmosphere that instantly told me something had changed, something irreversible, and while most people would have waited, asked questions, searched for explanations, I didn't, because there are moments in life where the truth doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. It reveals itself in fragments, in behaviors, in the small details that don't align with what you expect, and as I stood there watching her move through a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar, I realized that whatever had happened during that trip wasn't something that could be undone, only something that would eventually surface whether she wanted it to or not. She spoke carefully, choosing her words in a way that felt rehearsed, not because she had practiced them intentionally, but because she was trying to control something that was already slipping beyond control. And that effort showed itself in the pauses, in the way her sentences didn't quite connect, in the way she avoided anything that might lead to deeper questions. And that's the thing about truth. When it's being hidden, it doesn't disappear. It distorts everything around it, turning simple conversations into calculated exchanges, turning natural behavior into something forced. And as I listened, I wasn't focused on what she was saying, I was focused on what she wasn't saying, because absence in moments like that carries more weight than anything spoken. Days passed, and on the surface everything appeared. Normal routines continued. Conversations happened. Life moved forward in a way that might convince an outsider that nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, something was building, something quiet but undeniable. Because consistency in behavior doesn't always reflect consistency in truth, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about distance or miscommunication. It was about something far more significant, something that would eventually require more than avoidance to sustain. The confirmation didn't come dramatically. There was no sudden revelation, no emotional confrontation, just a moment, simple and controlled, where the truth became impossible to ignore. And in that moment everything aligned, every inconsistency, every hesitation. Every detail that didn't make sense before now formed a complete picture, and the picture didn't require interpretation. It was clear, direct and final, leaving no room for doubt about what had happened during that trip. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated, was that my response wasn't going to follow the path she expected. There would be no immediate confrontation, no raised voices, no visible reaction, because reactions like that often give away control, and control in situations like this is the only thing that matters. So, instead, I chose something else. Something quieter, something far more deliberate, something that would unfold at the right time in the right way, and that's when the envelope became relevant. The envelope wasn't something I created in that moment. It wasn't a reaction to what had happened. It existed long before her trip, long before any suspicion had formed, which is exactly why it mattered, because its purpose wasn't emotional. It was structural, something designed to hold value regardless of circumstances, and as I placed it in the drawer that night, untouched, unnoticed, it represented something she didn't yet understand. Not a threat, not a punishment, but a reality that would eventually reveal itself when the timing was right. Because timing in situations like this isn't about speed, it's about precision. About waiting until the moment where everything aligns in a way that leaves no room for confusion. She continued as if nothing had changed, maintaining routines, engaging in conversations, presenting a version of normal that might have been convincing under different circumstances. But normal behavior, when placed against an altered reality, doesn't restore balance. It creates tension. Because every action starts to feel slightly disconnected, slightly forced, and that disconnect becomes more visible the longer it's sustained, not through dramatic events, but through small inconsistencies that accumulate over time, forming a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once it reaches a certain point. The truth, when it finally surfaced in a way that couldn't be avoided, didn't arrive as an explanation. It arrived as confirmation, something already understood, now made explicit, and her words when she spoke them didn't carry the weight of revelation. They carried the weight of inevitability, because by then the outcome had already been accepted internally. and what remained wasn't shock but clarity, a clear understanding of what had happened and what it meant moving forward. Her expectation, whether she realized it or not, was that the situation would unfold in a familiar way, that there would be confrontation, emotional reaction, perhaps negotiation, because those are the patterns most people recognize, the responses they prepare for. But when those responses don't appear, when silence replaces reaction, it creates something far more unsettling, a space where uncertainty grows, where the lack of visible emotion becomes more impactful than any argument could be. And that's when I handed her the envelope, not dramatically, not as part of a confrontation, but calmly, almost casually placing it in her hands as if it were just another document, another detail in an otherwise ordinary moment. But the weight of it wasn't in its physical form, it was in what it represented, something already decided, something already in motion. Something that didn't depend on her reaction to become real. She didn't open it immediately, and that hesitation said more than anything she had said before, because when someone senses that something carries weight, they instinctively delay the moment of knowing, as if postponing the truth somehow softens it. But the truth doesn't weaken with time, it waits, and as she held the envelope in her hands, turning it slightly, as if trying to understand it from the outside, the silence between us grew heavier, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Because I wasn't going to rush her, I wasn't going to guide her through it. This was something she needed to step into on her own, fully aware, fully present, without distraction. When she finally opened it, there was no dramatic reaction at first, just a quiet shift in her expression. Subtle but unmistakable, because what she saw wasn't emotional. It was structured, precise, something that didn't argue or accuse it, simply stated, and statements like that don't create immediate chaos. They create understanding, a slow, heavy realization that builds as each detail is processed. Each line connected to the next, forming a picture that becomes clearer with every second. Inside wasn't just one document, it was a collection carefully arranged, each piece placed with intention, not to overwhelm, but to guide, to show a sequence. A structure that had been established long before this moment, and as she moved through them page by page, the consistency became impossible to ignore, because consistency removes doubt. It replaces speculation with certainty, and certainty, once reached, changes everything. It wasn't about catching her. It wasn't about proving anything in the way she might have expected. It was about clarity, about removing every possible misunderstanding, every potential argument, leaving only the reality of the situation exactly as it was. Because when everything is clearly defined, when nothing is left open to interpretation, resistance loses its strength. It has nothing to attach itself to. And that's when she looked up, not with anger, not with denial, but with something more complex, something closer to realization, because in that moment she understood that this wasn't a reaction. This wasn't something put together overnight. It was something that had been in place, waiting, existing quietly until it became necessary, and that understanding changed the entire dynamic, shifting it from confrontation to something far more controlled, far more final. For a few seconds after she looked up, neither of us said anything, and that silence carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with the kind of clarity that doesn't need to be explained. And as she held those papers in her hands, no longer flipping through them, but simply gripping them, as if trying to hold on to something stable, it became clear that she had already reached the point where denial was no longer an option. Because what she had just seen wasn't something she could argue with, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactive, it was structured, complete, and already in motion long before she even stepped back into the house. Her first instinct seemed to be to speak, to say something that could regain control of the situation, but the words didn't come easily, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because nothing she could say would change what was already established, and that's the difference between arguments and reality. Arguments can shift. They can evolve. They can be influenced, but reality, once defined clearly enough, remains fixed. And in that moment she understood that she wasn't standing in front of a situation that could be negotiated. She was standing in front of one that had already reached its conclusion. The documents weren't aggressive, they didn't accuse, they didn't explain emotions or intentions. They simply outlined conditions, outcomes and structures, and that's what made them powerful, because they didn't rely on convincing her of anything. They relied on clarity. On the fact that once something is presented in a complete and undeniable way, the need for persuasion disappears, leaving only the need for acknowledgement. She went back through them again, slower this time, more carefully, as if looking for something she might have missed the first time. Some detail that could shift the meaning, but the more she read, the more consistent everything became, every page reinforcing the same reality, every line connecting back to the same conclusion, and that consistency is what removed the last layer of uncertainty, because once everything aligns perfectly, doubt has nowhere to exist. And that's when the weight of it fully settled in, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, as the understanding moved from surface level into something deeper, something that affected not just what was happening now, but everything that would come after. Because situations like this don't just end in the moment they're revealed, they extend forward, shaping outcomes, decisions and possibilities in ways that can't be reversed once they begin. The shift in her wasn't immediate. It didn't explode into emotion the way most people would expect. Instead, it unfolded slowly, almost quietly, as if her mind was trying to process everything in layers rather than all at once, because when reality hits at that level of clarity, the first reaction isn't always visible. It's internal. It's the mind attempting to reorganize everything it thought was certain, everything it believed it could still control, and as she sat there holding those documents, her silence wasn't empty. It was active, filled with thoughts, calculations, realizations that were forming faster than she could express them, and that kind of silence is heavier than any argument because it means the truth has already begun to settle in. Eventually she tried to speak, but the words lacked direction. They weren't structured, they weren't confident. They were fragments, attempts to regain some level of control over a situation that no longer responded to her input. And that's what made it different, because in most conflicts words create movement. They shift momentum, they open space for negotiation, but here they didn't. They simply existed without impact, because everything that mattered had already been defined in a way that didn't rely on conversation to move forward. Her focus shifted between me and the papers, back and forth, as if trying to find a connection between the person she thought I was and the structure now sitting in her hands. And that disconnect is what made it unsettling for her, because people build expectations based on patterns, based on what they've seen before, and when something breaks that pattern completely, when someone responds in a way that doesn't match the version you had of them, it creates a kind of psychological distance that's hard to process in real time. That's when the emotional layer finally started to surface, not as anger, not as immediate blame, but as something more complex, something closer to realization mixed with regret, because she wasn't just reacting to what was happening now, she was reacting to what it meant, to the understanding that the situation had moved beyond a point where it could be reshaped, and that awareness carries a different kind of weight, one that doesn't fade quickly. And through all of it, I remained still, not detached, but controlled. Because control in moments like this isn't about dominance, it's about stability, about ensuring that nothing shifts unnecessarily, that everything unfolds exactly as it's meant to, and that consistency, that lack of reaction, is what made the situation feel even more final. Because it removed the last possibility of this turning into something familiar, something predictable, leaving only the reality as it was. As the silence stretched between us, it became clear that the moment itself was no longer the focus. It had already done its job. It had revealed what needed to be revealed, and now the weight was shifting toward what came next, because situations like this aren't defined by the moment of exposure. They're defined by the consequences that follow, the way everything begins to reorganize around a new reality. And, as she sat there holding the documents, no longer questioning what they meant, but beginning to understand what they would do, the space we were in started to feel different, not physically, but in meaning, as if everything within it had quietly adjusted to a new structure that couldn't be undone. Her thoughts had clearly moved ahead of the moment. You could see it in the way her expression changed, not rapidly but gradually, as realization extended beyond the present into the future, because once something like this is understood, it doesn't stay contained in the now, it spreads forward, touching every plan, every expectation, every assumption about what comes next. And that's where the real weight begins, not in what has already happened, but in what can no longer happen because of it. She started asking questions then, but they weren't the kind of questions meant to challenge or argue. They were searching, trying to map out the boundaries of this new reality, trying to understand how far it reached, what it affected, what it left untouched, and each answer, or sometimes the absence of an answer, only reinforced the same thing, that this wasn't limited, it wasn't isolated. It was comprehensive, designed to hold regardless of how she approached it, and that's what made it overwhelming, not the presence of consequences, but their completeness, the way they connected to everything, leaving no clear space outside of them, because when consequences are partial, when they only affect certain areas, there's room to adapt, to shift, to recover. But when they're structured to cover everything, adaptation becomes something entirely different. It becomes acceptance rather than adjustment. By that point, the dynamic between us had fully changed, not through words, not through confrontation, but through understanding, because once both sides recognize that a situation has reached its final form, interaction becomes something else. Entirely, it loses its unpredictability, its volatility, and becomes steady defined, almost quiet in its certainty. And that certainty is what makes it feel complete, because there's nothing left to question, nothing left to negotiate, only something to live with. At this stage, the situation had moved beyond reaction, beyond explanation, into something far more defined. A state where both of us understood exactly where things stood, without needing to repeat it, and that kind of understanding creates a different kind of silence, one that isn't uncertain or tense in the traditional sense, but heavy in its finality. Because when everything has been revealed and nothing remains hidden, there's no space left for assumptions, only the reality that now exists between two people who see the same truth but can no longer stand on the same ground. She no longer looked at the documents as something external, something separate from her. She had begun to internalize them, to understand that they weren't just outlining a situation. They were redefining it, reshaping everything moving forward. And that shift from observing to accepting is what marks the true turning point, because once something is accepted internally, even if it's not agreed with emotionally, it begins to influence every decision that follows. Her questions slowed down after that. Not because she had run out of things to ask, but because she had started to realize that the answers wouldn't change, that they were consistent, fixed, and already aligned with everything she had seen, and that consistency is what removes the need to keep searching. Because searching only continues as long as there's a possibility of finding something different. The emotional layer which had been building quietly beneath the surface became more visible now, not in dramatic expressions, but in subtle shifts, the way her posture changed, the way her focus drifted. The way her presence in the room felt less anchored than before, because when someone begins to process a reality they didn't expect, it doesn't always show. In obvious ways, it often appears in these small, almost imperceptible changes that carry far more meaning than loud reactions ever could. And through all of it, there was a growing awareness on both sides that this moment wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what it represented. A point where everything that had been uncertain became defined, where every possibility narrowed into a single path forward. And that path didn't need to be discussed to be understood, because its direction was already clear. By the time everything reached this point, there was nothing left to uncover, no hidden detail waiting to surface, no misunderstanding left to resolve. Only a fully revealed reality that both of us now understood in exactly the same way, and that shared understanding, despite everything that led to it, created a kind of stillness in the room. Not peaceful, not comfortable, but complete, because completion doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like weight, like the closing of something that can't be reopened, and as she sat there no longer reading, no longer questioning, just holding the documents as if they had become part of the moment itself, it became clear that this wasn't a situation that would evolve any further. It had already reached its final form. Her reaction at that stage wasn't about resistance anymore. It had moved past that. Because resistance requires uncertainty, it needs the belief that something can still be changed, and once that belief disappears, what replaces it isn't acceptance in the comforting sense, it's recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that everything has already been decided, that the direction forward exists regardless of how you feel about it, and that kind of recognition carries a different emotional weight. One that doesn't fade quickly because it's rooted in clarity rather than confusion. For me, there was no sense of victory in that moment, no feeling of having gained something from the situation, because it was never about winning. It was about ensuring that whatever happened, whatever choices were made, there was a structure in place that would hold, that wouldn't collapse under pressure or emotion, and that's what the envelope had always represented. Not an immediate reaction, but a long-standing certainty, something that existed quietly until it became necessary. Because the truth is, betrayal doesn't destroy you the moment it happens, it reveals who prepared for it before it ever did. And in the end, it wasn't the pregnancy that changed everything. It wasn't the trip. It wasn't even the truth she tried to hide. It was the moment she realized I was never unprepared.